past midnight on August 31st, 1888, when Polly Nichols left a rooming house in the East End district of London known as Whitechapel. For her, walking these streets at this hour was part of doing business, as it was for many women in this bleak, impoverished part of the city. But this time, Polly's business would turn deadly. Somewhere in the darkness, she met a knife-wielding stranger with a ruthless motive. This stranger would kill repeatedly during the next 10 weeks, always suddenly, always silently. And with each victim grew a murderous legacy that spread suspicion, fear, and panic. And even now, arouses fascination. Over a century later, the crimes remain unsolved and the stranger's identity unknown, except by a name that's become synonymous with evil. The discovery of Polly Nichols' body at 3:40 a.m. in Box Row was in itself no cause for panic in the East End of London. Crime was an everyday fact of life here, and women were not uncommon victims.
Working class women were no strangers to violence. The East End was a rough place. Working class marriages were often abusive.
Yet this killing did not have the look of a domestic dispute gone wrong. What set it apart was its savagery. The murderer made 2 deep cuts along Polly Nichols' neck, nearly severing her head from her body. She'd also been badly mutilated, with jagged incisions leading from her groin up to her breastbone. Still, even with a corpse, an approximate time of death, and knowledge of the weapon, the police had little to work with. Their inquiries produced no motive, no eyewitnesses, and no suspects. Within days, the search for Polly Nichols' murderer reached a dead end. But today, many are still hot on the killer's trail. From around the world they come, drawn to hear the grisly tale of murder and mayhem.
And as far as this story is concerned, its own police force.
It's called the Ripper Walk, one of many attractions that, along with books, articles, films and internet websites, support a multi-million-dollar industry born of a killer's brutality.
Violence was very much a part of these women's lives. And in the months preceding the Jack the Ripper murders, 2 prostitutes had already been brutally murdered.
In 1888, the idea of touring Whitechapel on foot would have struck most Victorians as sheer folly. A dismal, densely populated slum, it was home to the outcasts of society who eked out a meagre living not far from the hallowed halls of government.
The East End was London's poor quarter, and it was also the area identified with poverty and social problems. Life was hard. Life had, if it had pleasures, they were very immediate, they were momentary.
The presence of such squalor in the celebrated capital of the British Empire deeply troubled Victorian author Thomas Henry Huxley.
I assure you I found nothing worse, nothing more degrading, nothing so hopeless, nothing nearly so intolerably dull and miserable as life in the East End of London.
You've got to sort of look at the East End as sort of a maze of houses, tiny streets, people living 7, 8, 9 in a room, overcrowded tenements, living above cesspits. The children, 55% of them are dead before the age of 5. The women, they can't get work, so they prostitute themselves.
East End prostitutes earned very little. It was a very shabby kind of prostitution, perhaps in a lodging house, often sexual encounters in the streets.
So notorious was the area, it was known as the evil quarter mile. Now that same quarter mile draws amateur sleuths and curiosity seekers who walk many of the same streets and see many of the same sights as the world's first widely known serial killer.
Most of the Ripper's victims were women in their 40s who for one reason or another had abandoned lovers, husbands, boyfriends, families and taken a living on the streets. In appearance, their faces were puffy from drinking too much gin. They had cuts and bruises on their faces. They had teeth missing. You could buy an East End prostitute for 3 pennies, 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread.
9 days after Polly Nichols' murder on September the 8th, another brutal slaying occurred in Whitechapel. This time, the victim was a woman named Annie Chapman, an occasional prostitute who worked a local market area.
Behind me is the old Spitalfields fruit and vegetable market, built in 1887, 1 year before the murders. And until it closed down some years ago, it was still one of London's main fruit and vegetable markets.
So she went to the market on the 8th of September looking for a customer and was seen talking to a man who's described as a sort of foreign appearance, about in his 30s, wearing a deerstalker hat. They're seen talking outside number 29 Hanbury Street. The man is heard to ask, "Will you?" and Annie Chapman reply, "Yes."
It was a short time later that Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, having been murdered. A man called Albert Kadosh had come out of his house into the yard of the house next door and had heard a body or had heard something fall against the fence.
There's little doubt that she was killed by the same hand that killed Nichols. She'd had her throat cut, she was disemboweled.
While Chapman's death was more violent than Polly Nichols', the police were convinced the 2 killings were the work of the same person. Yet, given the evidence-gathering methods of the time, investigators were limited in their options.
Police can do very little except draft in extra reinforcements. It's hard to recognise now sort of how little in the way of scientific evidence the police would have been able to collect. You didn't have fingerprints, you didn't have blood groupings, you didn't have DNA.
Just 8 years before the murders, Scottish physician Henry Faulds published an article on the value of finger impressions as a means of criminal identification. Yet the use of what today is called fingerprinting and other now standard tools of detection was still a long way off.
It's going to be another 14 years before you get the first fingerprint conviction. Similarly, in 1888, the difference could not be told between animal and human blood. So you could have a situation where the murderer could be standing here and the victim could be lying there. The murderer could be covered in the victim's blood. He could have left his fingerprints and handprints all over the murder scene. With the state of scientific knowledge that existed in 1888, there was no way you could put the two together. The murderer has quite literally got to be caught in the act of murder.
As it was, they were stuck with applying the lessons that had been used for a long, long time, which were look for witnesses, act very quickly at the scene of murders, knock on doors. Get off your backside and knock on doors is an old adage of detectives that's been about for a long time. What they relied on mostly was eyewitness accounts, and as we know now, those can be very misleading.
Misleading indeed. While there were no eyewitnesses to the killings, there was no shortage of informants. Descriptions of suspicious individuals in the vicinity of the crimes often led the police in different directions.
I think he was wearing an overcoat, but I cannot be sure. He was a man over 40. As far as I could tell, he seemed a little taller than the deceased.
He had a hard billycock hat. He had a blotchy face and a carroty moustache.
He was a fine-looking man. He wore an overcoat with a cape, high hat, not a silk one, and a Gladstone bag.